Tansi, Sego, Anin, Hello, Jordan Carina, Sika-san, Egwa, Treaty 4, specifically Regina, Saskatchewan, Onitia, and a member of Pipot First Nation. Pogo, Hamilton, Ontario, for the past 20 years, Niguin Miigwets. My name is Jordan Carrier, and I'm originally from Treaty 4, Regina, Saskatchewan, and a member of Pipot First Nation. But now I live in Hamilton, Ontario, for the past 20 years. You are listening to the One Dish, Many Stories podcast, the show that aims to amplify the stories of these lands, now known as Hamilton, and the Indigenous peoples who have historically and currently live on these lands. Today, I will share the story of the mass medical evacuations that occurred in the mid-20th century that relocated Inuit and Cree peoples from their communities in the Eastern Arctic to the Mountain Sanatorium right here in Hamilton. We will hear from our guest for this episode, Amber Lyn, who is a Jamaican Inuk soapstone carver and an artist who lives in Hamilton, as they share their journey to soapstone carving, what it means to them for their cultural identity and healing, and also they will share some of their spoken word poetry with us. Hi, Miigwech, Nyawa, thank you for joining us. Many diseases came to these lands known as Canada and the rest of Turtle Island, and one of these diseases was tuberculosis, otherwise known as TB. TB is a highly infectious disease. It's a chronic disease that no one is fully cured of and has been an epidemic. It has greatly impacted Indigenous communities, including the Inuit. During the 1940s and 50s, a mass survey of Indigenous peoples in the North was conducted, and those suspected of having TB were evacuated to the South for treatment. One of the views of the disease like TB is that it's a poor person's disease, which is why it was so prevalent among Indigenous communities. Some of the factors that are taken into consideration are overcrowded housing, precarious forms of obtaining food, poor sanitation, inaccessibility to medical services. But when considering these factors, one must also consider the impact of settlers, the rise of capitalism, and how those things impacted Indigenous communities. What does this have to do with Hamilton? More than 1,200 Inuit were sent to the Mountain Sanatorium right here in Hamilton, which is the largest population of Inuit living outside of the Arctic. What exactly was the rationale between evacuating Inuit from their homes in the north to the south rather than providing them health services in the north? There are a few different ideas of the rationale, and often it's driven by money. Often arguing it was impossible to recruit specialists to the north. Other reasons being that if the disease was going to kill the population, building adequate medical centers equipped with adequate resources, including the human resources, eventually the population would be gone and the need for these centers would cease to exist. An additional thought was that if they were going to eradicate the disease, that too would end the need for the centers. The infection rate among the Inuit grew rapidly, and according to the Public Health Agency of Canada, of all the Indigenous populations that were impacted by TB, the Inuit were the ones with the highest rate of infections. What was it like for Inuit patients who were evacuated from the north to come here to Hamilton to be treated at the Mountain Sanatorium? First, let's consider the change in climate. When Inuit folks arrived in the summer, they were dressed for the north in their parkas and their mucklucks. They would arrive in Hamilton on a hot summer day in July, not prepared or dressed for this change of climate. Trying to imagine what that would have been like and how difficult it would have been to adjust. Further to this adjustment, what about those who'd spent years in the sanatorium here in Southern Ontario, or who were born here because their parents were patients at the sanatorium and then later sent home to the north without proper preparation or knowledge of how it was to live in such an extreme climate? Not only was the change in climate and environment a huge change, but lifestyle, from food and community and language. Basically everything about their lives were changed. One of the other disruptions that Inuit faced was their disconnection from their family who stayed in the north. There was poor or no record keeping of patients who were sometimes transferred to other facilities. Sadly, there were even times when patients died and their families were not notified. Between the years of 1952 and 1963, 37 Inuit patients died in the Hamilton Mountain Sanatorium and were left in unmarked graves. And it was not until 1995 when a memorial was erected in the Woodland Cemetery in commemoration of these lives. This project was made possible through a partnership with the city of Iqaluit and the government of Canada and the city of Hamilton. A bit of a trigger warning before I go into this next part is a term that I'm going to use because of it was used at the time. There was an article written in 1958 in Maclean's magazine by Frank Croft. It was titled "The Changing Eskimos of the Mountain San." This article was difficult for me to read as the word Eskimo was used over 40 times through the entire article. Additionally, in the very first paragraph, Croft says, "We can cure them and sometimes amuse them, but we can't convince them that our world is better." Throughout the article, he talks about the Inuit patients in dehumanizing ways, even referring to them as freight on the aircraft that transported them from the north to Hamilton. He continues to argue that white man's medicine is of curing them, and they show little gratitude. The article paints a picture of how Inuit patients were perceived as primitive, uncivilized, ungrateful, and problematic. Cross shares how food was an issue because the food that was offered was much different than what the patients were used to in the north. This article demonstrates the attitudes and beliefs of the time that white man and white man's medicine was going to be the cure. It does not address the disease was brought by colonization in the first place and treats the Inuit as primitive and less than beings. Although it seems that it was understood that Inuit patients stayed as connected to their language and home the best way they could. The final line in the article reads, "No Eskimo has ever been heard to say that he would like to remain in the land of central heating, television, and packaged foods. Flowers, trees, and men riding horses across little screens and shooting at each other. Electronically driven sewing machines are lots of fun, but for the Eskimos, as for anyone, there is no place like home." One of the most startling things I learned about was that there was personal letters that were being sent home to the north that were being translated so that the patients wrote them in their language, and the letters were translated to English. This leaves to question why personal letters that were going from one speaker to another speaker needed to be translated. These were personal letters to family. Why would the resources be put into the translation? These letters being surveilled? But within these letters, we learned that the stories spoke of loneliness and people concerned for their family back home. APTN did an investigative piece on the letters in 2017, and through the collection of documents from the Library and Archives of Canada, revealed that letters were being collected by the Department of Northern Affairs and Natural Resources into the 1960s. These letters were filed in a collection called Eskimo Correspondent Records. The daughter of one of the men who were in the Mountain Sanatorium read her father's letter for the first time in 2019. She shared he spent 4 years in the sanatorium, and the letter shared how frustrated he was that he could not leave, how he was concerned for his family back home. She also shares that he and many others in her community who were patients in the sanatorium did not want to talk about it. It was a dark and traumatic experience and time of their lives, and they never wanted to share about it. On March 8th, 2019, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, issued an apology on the behalf of the Government of Canada to the Inuit for the management of the treatment of the TB epidemic. Through the apology, the Prime Minister acknowledges while Canada was adopting the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the government of Canada was treating Inuit as inferior beings. He also draws comparisons to how Canadian children were being praised for learning their ABCs and that Inuit children were being punished for speaking their language. The acknowledgement that the colonial mindset was in full force in separating Inuit from culture, language, family, and land. During the apology, it was also announced the launch of Nunavut Initiative, which is a collaboration with Inuit partners. This initiative through Nunavut Inc. It's a database where Inuit can put names of the ones who were sent to sanatoriums and never returned. This project is working to find where patients from the sanatoriums ended up if they did not return home to the north. Once a grave is found, 2 members of families will be supported for travel to the gravesite and supported with providing a marker for the grave. In addition to this support, mental health supports are available to Inuit. The database went live on March 8th, 2019, and the first grave was found 5 days later. Nunavut translates to "let's find them." It's truly startling that so many patients came to the south to be treated, and so many were never heard of again and never returned to the north. The loss of the loved ones to the TB epidemic has been a significantly traumatic event for Inuit communities and their families that is still felt today. While living in the sanatorium was very different than life in the north and very unpleasant for Inuit patients, the occupational therapy program attempted to relieve some of this by including soapstone carving for men and sewing for women. The carvings were often reminiscent of life in the north, including hunters and seals and polar bears, and these carvings were marketed and sold to tourists. So it's really interesting that while all around them their culture was being devalued and taken away, that it was also being celebrated in other ways, like these soapstone carvings being sold. And while they were not sold as fine art pieces, the carvings were sold at a cost that would be able to recoup the cost of materials that the hospital would have paid for. 5% went to the hospital, and whatever was left over went back to the patients, in which they can use in the canteen. In 2017, the Art Gallery of Hamilton hosted an exhibit called Carving Home, the Shidok Collection of Inuit Art. There are more than 100 pieces that were left over at the hospital, and now the Art Gallery of Hamilton is the steward of the collection. The gallery's position is understanding the presentation and interpretation of the material must be driven by voices and knowledge of those closest to its creation. The exhibit team includes a former patient of the sanatorium who was 5 years old when she was first sent there. As we are citizens of these lands and continue to say words like reconciliation, we need to understand the truth and the history of this place, how settler colonialism has impacted the distinct groups of Indigenous peoples. The story of Inuit patients and their experience in the Mountain Sanatorium is one we should all know. Seeing our great city having a hand in this dark part of our past is jarring to think of those unmarked graves of patients who died and the emptiness that must have left with families and communities in the north. We are in a time when unmarked graves of Indigenous children are being found on the grounds of residential schools across this country. Like most Canadians, after the discovery of the graves in Kamloops, Hamiltonians ran smack dab into the truth of what this nation was built on. Many attended vigils around the city, rushed to purchase orange shirts, and say that they were ready to listen and act. Until recently, I did not know about the unmarked graves of the Inuit patients here in Hamilton. How many more people in the city are unaware of this history? And what can we do as a city to acknowledge this tragic event and the lives of the Inuit patients, families, and communities who were impacted by the TB epidemic, and how they continue to be part of the healing process? I encourage my fellow Hamiltonians to continue to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples within this city. And I'm very excited to wrap up this episode by inviting my friend Amber, who's a soapstone carver and she herself is Inuit. So we're going to talk to her and hear about her journey to soapstone carving and how that contributes to her uh, cultural identity and well being. All right. So first, I'm just going to thank you again for your time. I really appreciate you being here and adding this to the episode I am doing on the Inuit's experience at the Mountain Sanatorium here in Hamilton. And I think it'd be really beautiful to wrap up with some showcase of resilience and culture and the amazing person that you are and sharing some of your art. So from there, I'll just like you to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Amber. I am Afro-Inuk. I am a member of Nunatu Kavu, and I am reconnecting. So I am a reconnecting Inuk who did not grow up around my culture, but soapstone carving has been a really important part of my healing and my reconnecting journey. So I do have a spoken word piece that I would like to share that just kind of explains my perspective and my experiences. It's called "My Ancestors See What They Never Could." In carving, I have found a different way of knowing. I do not know much yet. My journey of reconnecting is fresh. What I do know is that I have always felt the need to fight to be heard, to fight to be seen. And since learning how to carve, I have also learned to be seen and loved by myself. I see myself in my carvings, in the stone that is so precious and beautiful, but in places also cracked and fragile from the trauma of being ripped from the earth by dynamite or by rough handling in transport. I see myself in the music as it flows through my body, restrained by conditioned reminders to not move too freely or exist too boldly. I see myself in the wind as it dances through the leaves, squeezed between high-rise buildings as it rushes to the freedom of the tree line. I do not know much, but I do know that this is the medicine that I have found so far. With it came peace and reassurance, and realizing that there are other ways of knowing that my ancestors may have wanted me to know, for my spirit to grow and to heal. Peace and reassurance, and realizing that finding peace in those ways of knowing does not make me a sinner, just a sinner in need of salvation. It just means that I am a being in need of healing. And I found no healing in the ways of knowing that I was given. Love, yes, but healing, no. I have found clarity and vision in the crumbs of knowing that I have found elsewhere. And that is all the reassurance I need to know that my path is my own. I do not need to believe the gaslighting present within Christianity of thinking anything other is a sin. My perspective is as intersectional as my trauma, and carving is my medicine.
Wow. That's incredibly moving.
Hi.
And so,
Sorry. It's still fresh. Like I literally just wrote that yesterday. So, if you think that that's appropriate, and I don't like just bringing up the church in general. It's a super sensitive topic, and I just depending on when this is released, I don't want to be insensitive to other people's traumas and how that might trigger them. But as far as carving goes, I was lost for a really long time and kind of just gaslit into thinking that I was angry and that I was just the problem. And when I, at least came to the realization that that was not the case and that was it was okay and not a sin for me to look elsewhere for my healing, I found a freedom that I didn't have before. So, And so carving teaches me many lessons. There are some pieces that I learn patience from, because if I try to carve them too quickly, or if I'm, just in a rush on what I want it to be, it doesn't turn out as beautifully as when I kind of take my time and come back to it after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, or some I've come back to over a couple of years. And the version that it was when I gave it that time is so much more beautiful than it was when I was rushing it.
Mm-hmm.
So little lessons like that I kind of get from carving. And there's actually one piece, the second piece that I ever carved, it was in a workshop. That's how I first learned how to carve. So this isn't something that was handed down, because my mom was adopted, so she was not raised within her community. And so my first initial, introduction to carving was in a workshop at a Lee Valley course, which I'm really grateful for. But I do wish that I had, received a little bit of that in the passing down from other generations, because there are carvers in my family, but we only met them in probably the last 10 or 15 years, and they live pretty far out in Goose Bay, Happy Valley, Labrador. So we have been out there once to meet them. I learned first at the Valley course. The topic had been like the item that they wanted us to carve was an Inukshuk, which I'm also grateful for, but not having the fact that it was an Inuit carver who was teaching us to carve an Inukshuk didn't necessarily feel 100% what I would have wanted that experience to be, for the first time, an introduction to that particular medium. But anywho, I went for a two-piece Inukshuk. So it's two Inukshuks, one that is taller for an adult, and then the smaller baby one, but it was one piece, connected by the hands. And it had split right in the middle where they were meant to connect. And the symbolism of that was not lost on me.
Right.
So I did want to repair that connection between the two generations. The symbolism is another thing that in carving, it reveals itself to me. It's not always what I thought it would be when I started the piece. It teaches me things and just shows me metaphors of life like that. And so I did repair it initially. I just glued it back together and it was connected. Yes. But over the years, I was content with that, but I wasn't fulfilled by it. Every time I looked at it, I would just see break because it was so obvious. I had fixed it, but I hadn't mended it. And so it stuck out whenever I looked at it. And after a couple of years, I just thought, I want it not just symbolize generations surviving. I wanted it to symbolize generations thriving. And so I went back to it and I just fixed around that little area to see if I could make the pain less drastic when you look at it, because it was such an obvious break between them. And it did. It came out so much more beautiful. You can't even see the break. It looks completely healed in that connection between the two. And those are the types of lessons that I learned from carving.
Wow. I'm a little lost for words, like just listening to that story and imagining that, because I think of this particular, even this episode, the first part of the episode, and I talk about such a traumatic experience. And I was like, how do I want to wrap up this episode? Like, being that it's such a hard thing to discuss, and automatically then I was like, oh, I have this beautiful friend who does this beautiful art that showcases that resilience and that strength. And then that story, I think, just really also symbolizes what I was hoping this episode we'd be able to do with our conversation, that demonstration of colonization and the way that colonialism has impacted Indigenous peoples across this land. But we're still here and we're reclaiming everything that was taken from us. So, oh my God, I'm just like almost like really emotional. And I'm just so grateful that you shared that with me.
Oh, thank you. It's my honor. It's taken a lot to get to that point, but when I found just spoken word and when I found carving, it felt so right that I knew I could trust it. And I knew that if I just followed it, that it would lead me wherever I was going. I might not know where it is, and might not know what cultures I have lost, but I do know that it's helping me to heal. And that's what carving means to me.
That's so beautiful. Is there anything else you would like to share?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. That's like so much that I don't want to like distract from that. You know, there's a lot more about it. As I said, I'm also Afro-Inuk, but I'm also queer. So growing up in the church, there's a lot of other things that carving helps me to cope with. A lot of other emotional traumas that have kind of been dismissed and kind of gaslit by this concept of this is the one way to live, and anything that I was experiencing other wasn't really acknowledged. So there are definitely other aspects of that as well with my identity. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I am so grateful for you. I can't even like describe like the words. Grateful doesn't even feel like it's the right word. And grateful is such a beautiful thing to experience for you sharing your time and your relationship to carving. I'm very fortunate to be the proud owner of some of your carvings that sits here in my office. They're actually on the shelf over here that I have received from you, and I truly treasure them as gifts. I don't know how you feel if we want to highlight your social media and some of the things that you try to do through your carving as far as like raising funds for Toronto harm reduction, or if you want to, direct folks to your social media if they ever want to try to help support that.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. Yes, I do a little bit of fundraising with my art because art is so personal and such a part of my spiritual journey. It doesn't feel right to just start off my the carvings that I share with the world for profit. So most of my carving up until now has just been gifts to friends and family, people that I meet like you. But about 2 years ago, I did start to try to auction a couple of them on Instagram to see if, because I didn't have money that I could personally donate to causes that I cared about, I could donate my art and my time. And so then I could auction it, and whoever wanted to pay the money for that piece, I could use that money to donate. So yes, I have been able to support a couple causes. The most recent one was from Indigenous harm reduction. So that went really well. We were able to raise, I think, about $245. That particular auction actually inspired a donation commission. So somebody that I met I told them a little bit about what I did and what I was trying to do, because it was at the time that I was doing the fundraiser, I was also trying to get them interested. And they were so inspired by that they said that they would offer to buy a separate piece and that I could use that money. So that's the piece that I'm currently working on right now. And it's going to make $300 that I will be able to redirect. And this piece, I'm going to use those funds to redirect to the Native Art Society. It's an art gallery in Toronto that is also run by the caring individuals who run Toronto Indigenous harm reduction. So right now they're showcasing an art show. So I want to use part of those funds to buy the pieces, because all of the funds for the art pieces go directly to the artist. And then I want to donate the rest of the money to the gallery itself so they can continue to offer that space for Indigenous artists in Toronto.
Oh, that's amazing.
Thank you. Yes, so if you want to see any of that, you can check out my Instagram. It's Amber Lyn. My name is Amber Lyn, so that's just a funny little quip on that. But I did recently post about the gift of giving, which is something that was passed down to me by my mother. She's the one who took me to the first soapstone carving class. We did pottery growing up, but she wanted to make sure that I had my own art outlet, and so she is the one who brought me to soapstone carve. And so this is just kind of a tribute to her. The gift of giving. A lesson I learned early in life, watching my mother create beautiful pieces of pottery to share with those she loved. Customizing concept and design to suit the intended or sometimes spontaneous recipient. Over the years, her artistic outlets, as with my own, have changed and evolved, but the act of giving has always remained constant within our art. Money is not always available to give, but giving of our time and of our craft can lead to even more depth in the ways we choose to give. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm lost for words. I am just incredibly grateful, and this is really special for me. So thank you.
Awesome. I'm so happy to be included. Thank you for thinking of me. It was an honor, and I'm just so happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. Well, I will let you get back to your Sunday and your carving. And thanks again. Like I feel like I'm saying 1,000 times, but I'm just so grateful.
Thank you. I can't wait to hear the podcast once it's out.
I'll send you the link once it's ready to go.
Okay.
All right. Okay, good night.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye. Before sharing my sources, I do want to apologize if I mispronounce any of the Inuit language while sharing. Sources for the research for this episode include Dark Gallery of Hamilton Carving Home website, an article from the Maclean's Magazine archive from 1958, the Nunascoic News, Survival, Legacy, Epidemics, and Pandemics in Hamilton website by the Hamilton Civic Museum, the Nunavut Initiative through the Inuit Regional Corporation, AP10 Investigates, The Great White Plague by Canadian Art, Nobody Here Will Harm You, a book by Sean Selway, and the statement of apology on behalf of the Government of Canada to the Inuit for the mismanagement of the tuberculosis epidemic. And of course, to our amazing guest, Amber Lyn. And our special thanks and shout outs to Dr. Vanessa Watts at McMaster University, again for supervising this project, and to Claude Sapafora for post-production support and getting this all ready for our listeners. Hi, miigwech nyawe. Thank you for listening. Again, if you wish to support the episode or support me and the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on your social media, leave a rating and a review. And to catch the latest from me, follow me on Instagram at mzz.0rdan or on Twitter at Jordan_Carrier. And this wraps up the 3-part series for the National Indigenous History Month. I hope to be back in the future at some point with more episodes because there is so many more stories to tell. So stay tuned and maybe we'll be back.